I want to set the scene with my colleague Max over the next few minutes about just how powerful the dominant platforms are at manipulating and distorting what people can see, say on social media, chatbots, app stores, search, and how this is a dangerous level of corporate, unaccountable power that can tilt entire political debates. On X, we've watched algorithms systematically amplify extremist and far-right content, from disproportionately boosting far-right parties in German elections to fueling xenophobia by spreading racist falsehoods in UK after a stabbing. Elon Musk has personally intervened to amplify voices he favors and censor those that he opposes. He has even manipulated the Grok chatbot to promote Trumpism, neo-Nazism, and myths about white genocide. In Brazil, Musk refused to comply with court orders related to content moderation and called the judge a censor. This is billionaire-driven propaganda and platform manipulation that seeks to undermine liberal democracy, and Musk is not alone. TikTok has boosted far-right candidates in Germany and Romania and removed content that is unwelcome in Beijing and critical of Trump in the US. Now it's set to be controlled by a pro-Trump billionaire who is also a media mogul and Oracle co-founder. Meta and Google are no different. Facebook illegally downranked politicians' posts, according to a Belgian court. Instagram censored hashtags related to Democrats during the US elections, and across its platforms, peaceful expression of support for Palestinians amid the genocide in Gaza have been systematically censored at scale. Google has blocked searches, AI searches for Trump and dementia. YouTube's recommender system has long fueled extremism, steering users towards conspiracy theorists and far-right propaganda, while penalizing journalists, including independent media in Russia and Ukraine. The business models of Google, X, and TikTok depend on surveillance, using behavioral data to modify and manipulate attention and belief for paying clients. Their vision for AI, with omnipresent personalized chatbots mediating how people learn, create, socialize, and work, using behavioral data to modify, and risks amplifying already unacceptable levels of corporate control over freedom of thought, over freedom of speech, and using the expression as a point to eliminate human autonomy and ultimately the preconditions for liberal democracy. And their power does not stop at shaping political debate. It extends to dismantling the very institutions that hold them accountable, like journalism. For decades, these platforms have siphoned, monopolized digital advertising, access to audiences, and now they're stripping news content to train the AI models that they are building without consent or compensation, turning the work of reporters into unpaid fuel for the very tools that will threaten to replace them and which are pumping AI junk out to drown out the information. Corporate retaliation against modest efforts to require big tech to pay for the news they use have become equally systematic. Meta censored news accounts in Australia and Canada in retaliation for proposed legislation attempting to require fair compensation for the use of publisher content. Google has also censored journalistic content in attempts to regulate in California and Europe, conducting tests, suppressing news content in an attempt to intimidate the news industry. And big tech extracts content and advertising revenue, inserts itself between publishers and advertisers, and then weakens or diminishes any efforts to regulate. And what's at stake isn't just fairness in the market, but the survival of independent journalism, and with it, the democratic checks and balances that keep concentrated power in line. The result is an information system dominated by platform monopolies that have every incentive to manipulate and suppress dissent, including at the behest of rising authoritarian leaders in the US. And we are witnessing a fusion of corporate and state power take institutional form as leading tech executives have been given unprecedented access to government systems and appointed lieutenant colonels in the US Army Reserve. Private control over critical communications infrastructure, from social media to satellites to AI systems, is allowing a handful of tech billionaires and their platforms to shape information flows, military operations, and even the tools of governance itself. This blurring of the public and private roles, absent any real oversight or democratic accountability, marks a dangerous normalization of a world where those who build the machinery of surveillance and censorship and persuasion now help decide how and against whom it is deployed. And this control and manipulation of our information ecosystems is not just algorithmic bias. It is a function of market dominance and unaccountable interference in our democratic processes. Over the past year, the US government and dominant tech firms launched a campaign to undermine digital legislation in Europe, equating regulation with censorship. The campaign targets the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, as well as other laws that apply to the very largest digital and AI platforms. And the administration in the US has inaccurately portrayed these laws as foreign censorship and taxes on American firms. These attacks appear aimed at achieving three objectives: to protect US platforms from public oversight and accountability, to weaken European sovereignty, and to clear the way for extremist parties and those who directly oppose liberal democracy. The scale and scope of this interference is unprecedented. The House Judiciary Committee subpoenaed tech companies for information about their communication with EU lawmakers related to their implementation of democratically passed laws. The chair sent a letter to European officials demanding an end to foreign censorship. And last month, they held a public hearing in Congress to give critics of EU and UK legislation and big tech lobbyists a platform to air their grievances. The White House has repeatedly and explicitly threatened stiff tariffs in retaliation against European nations that dare to regulate American tech companies that are operating in their jurisdictions. And the State Department announced a new policy restricting visas for those officials and their families who are engaged in censorship of Americans. There was an official memo that disparaged Europe's Orwellian content moderation and its impact on the free speech rights of American citizens and companies in what was truly an Orwellian memo. The secretary also instructed US countries that attack our incredible American tech companies, claiming that digital taxes, digital services legislation, and digital markets regulation are all designed to harm or discriminate against American technology. And Vice President Vance has used high-profile diplomatic fora to attack European digital governance, declaring that the greatest threat facing Europe was not external adversaries, despite a war right across the street in Ukraine, but its own democratic institutions, calling EU officials commissars for cracking down on illegal content on social media and characterizing EU privacy protections and AI regulation as tools for authoritarian censorship. These statements and actions and manipulation of trade and diplomacy represent a deliberate and disingenuous attempt to delegitimize European democratic decision-making and enforcement to the benefit of American corporate power, which is increasingly indistinguishable from state power, as my colleague Max is going to explain a bit further.
Thanks, Courtney, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to build on Courtney's remarks, focusing more on the European picture, but I'm just going to check that this clicker works because I think there's been some issues with the slides. That's going the wrong way. Okay, there we go. So Courtney has laid out very well how the US administration is attacking Europe's laws. But I want to talk a little bit about how this is emboldening the US tech giants to ramp up their own criticism of the EU's digital rulebook whether that is in tacit or in explicit collusion with the US administration. So as we all know, weak or even non-compliance by US tech firms with EU laws has long been a serious issue. But I think what we've seen in recent months is that that defiance has been turning into open resistance. So just last month, Apple called for the Digital Markets Act, one of the EU's flagship laws, to be abolished. And this is a law that is designed to promote contestability in digital markets that Apple has spent many months trying to frustrate, including being fined by the European Commission for non-compliance. Meanwhile, Meta, with its CEO Mark Zuckerberg leading the charge, has changed its content moderation policies to align with the priorities of the Trump administration. It's echoed the administration's language on supposed censorship and protectionism, as Courtney was outlining, and it's explicitly called on the US government to defend its interests abroad. And then for its part, Elon Musk's X has all but abandoned compliance with the Digital Services Act. I think many of us have experienced that for ourselves using the platform, but there's also a growing list of non-compliance investigations under the DSA, all of which speaks for itself. As for Google, Google has also very aggressively kind of scaled up its attacks on EU regulation this year, and also recently pulled out of the EU's code of practice on disinformation, which it said simply wasn't appropriate or effective for its services. But I think the most extreme criticism has come from Peter Thiel, the tech investor, founder of PayPal, who, according to a recent Washington Post article in a private speech, described not only Greta Thunberg, but anyone trying to put regulatory limits on technology as, quote, legionnaires of the Antichrist, which I think is definitely an original way of describing EU bureaucrats. But I think more seriously, it's absurd, but I think it's actually very revealing of the attitude that many in Silicon Valley have to any attempts to put limits on their power, even modest ones. So as we've heard, the US administration, its allies in Congress, and the tech giants have focused on two main arguments in their attacks on EU legislation. Firstly, that it enables censorship, and secondly, that it is an attempt to deliberately weaken American corporations. But these claims don't withstand much scrutiny. Not a single piece of EU tech legislation, whether that's the DMA or the DSA, the AI Act, the GDPR, singles out companies based on their nationality, which would actually be not only against WTO rules, but against the EU's own treaties. And yes, it's true that the majority of the firms, for example, under the DMA and DSA that are designated are American, but this isn't because of their nationality, but because of their market dominance and the systemic effect that they have on our societies. And of course, several European and non-US companies have been designated under these laws, including ByteDance, Booking.com, Shein, and Zalando. And any European business that reaches the level of scale needed to trigger the thresholds of these laws will also be captured in the future, as is only fair. The idea that the EU is attempting to censor political speech is also tenuous. Obviously, regulating communications platforms is a delicate task, and there is always the risk of overreach, which we have to be aware of. But so far, there's no compelling evidence that the DSA has been used to censor speech, despite the best efforts of Republicans in the US to prove the opposite. And in fact, I would go so far as to argue that the DSA not only doesn't allow governments to censor speech, but actually it does the opposite by equipping governments and citizens to challenge censorship and manipulation by tech platforms. And that includes requiring platforms to provide much greater transparency on their content moderation systems, on their recommender algorithms, and also giving users formal rights to actually challenge unfair takedowns of their content. And so, as Courtney pointed out, I think we need to see these attacks for what they are. They're an attempt by the US government to place US corporations beyond the law and to weaken the sovereignty and democratic prerogatives of Europe and nations around the world. The key question is, how has Europe responded to all of this interference? And I would say, to its credit, despite fears that Europe would simply sacrifice its competition and digital rules as a bargaining chip with the Trump administration in trade negotiations, that isn't what has happened, and the EU has largely stood firm so far. So we've had strong statements from Commissioners Verkunen and Ribera, for example, in defense of these laws, and also from President von der Leyen herself, who earlier this year described these rules as, quote, untouchable sovereign decisions. So, that's positive. And we've seen continued enforcement in practice. For example, several US gatekeepers have been fined for non-compliance with the DMA, perhaps not enough, but they have been. And a major antitrust investigation into Google's ad tech monopoly is still ongoing, and a breakup still remains on the table. I'd also say we're seeing much more awareness of the both economic and political dangers of relying on a handful of tech giants for critical digital infrastructure. There's a lot of momentum behind the Eurostack movement, for example, which is seeking to build European alternatives to US tech infrastructure that represents European values and not Silicon Valley's. But there's also cause for concern. Some enforcement actions, and I'm thinking in particular of the investigations into X under the DSA, which I mentioned, have been essentially frozen for what appear to be political reasons. And then we have the EU's anti-coercion instrument, which would seem to be the perfect tool to respond to the threats from the US, and which would allow the EU, for example, to impose targeted retaliation on US tech companies. But that instrument is not being used, and for the moment is gathering dust. But to conclude, I think these battles that we're all witnessing today will essentially determine whether the future of technology is controlled by a handful of corporate titans or by the interests and needs of citizens. And so now is the time for Europe and for democracies around the world facing these challenges to step up. So thank you.